So chapter 10, this is the one you were looking for. I would say this is the cumulative chapter of the book. I technically think biological from a human perspective, chapter 9 was more cumulative as all the course concepts kind of came into that long chapter. Although this is more of an ecosystem kind of accumulation. Okay, we know what we're made of. Well, okay, well, how does that keep getting returned and cycled through each generation of organism? So biogeochemical cycles. I like this quote from Thoreau, especially as I get older, because it's like, okay, you can have this money, but I'm not going to exchange any time of my life. Time is more valuable than money. But even when you're young, there's so much in this one quote, just from understanding something as simple as nothing is free. There's always some kind of other exchange in anything. Nothing is free. There's a lot. You could talk for a long time about this quote. So here are the objectives for this chapter. We're going to look at symbiosis. Hopefully you've heard that term before. We're going to break all these words down, so if you haven't, it's okay. The efficiency. So energy goes through an ecosystem. It always starts in the sun, and it winds up being diluted little by little through metabolic processes. So yeah, the terms are still going to come back. I'm sorry. I know you thought you were done with some of this. No, unfortunately, no. And then recognize molecular changes in the biochemical cycles, biogeochemical cycles. So you will see a lot of molecules in these cycles themselves, but I'm going to cut to the chase in this video. So hang with me. I have very basic images in the book. They get kind of complex though, and there's a lot there. If you hang with this video, you'll get the shortcut through this. And then the recycling of elements through all organisms. So we're going to talk about some of the metabolic processes we've already discussed in the course and tie those in nicely to how matter is cycled. Hopefully you've been to one of these places. I forget where the other one is, the first one with the manatees. It's so focused in you can't really tell. Obviously the one on the right is Silver Springs. Not Silver Springs, Rainbow Springs in Dunellen. You go to these springs and you get out in nature a little bit. It's helpful to really get some connection, get some peace, get away from people. If you go on the right day, you can get away from people. Otherwise, it's packed. But we're going to be speaking of ecosystems, and especially some in Florida as they relate. So up in the top right corner of this slide, I'm bringing up something that goes all the way back to chapter 1 and chapter 2. Which 4 elements are you made of? 96% of you are made of these 4 elements. Hopefully that came right up in your brain. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Well, this is where we're going to talk about how those elements are cycled and recycled and recycled. It's pretty disturbing, I guess, maybe to some people, that everything that you're made of, everything that you eat, everything that you breathe, has all been ate, breathed, and used by another organism. Everything's recycled. It's crazy. If you live out in the country, rural areas, you know you have well, and think of the aquifer itself. And all that water is recycled. It hits the top, it drips down through the limestone and gets cleansed to a point, depending on what people are putting on the surface in the dirt. But everything's recycled when it comes to the matter on the earth. So bio meaning life, geo meaning generically it means earth, but say, rocks, geology, the study of rocks, but where rocks come from, the earth. So life, earth, chemicals. So what are the chemicals in the earth, in the dirt, in the soil, in the rocks, in the water, that come full circle to become part of organisms and then back through decomposition and decomposers back into nature? So some ecological terms. Eco, it means house. It's like economics, the study of finances within a house, within a system. Microeconomics is within a country, and macroeconomics is international. And I probably botched those terms a bit for those of you who are doing business. But for the more basic explanation, it's how something works within a system defined by those parameters. Is it a microcosm, like just within Ocala, or is it a macrocosm within the United States or even the world? So ecos means house. So it means what is the study of what is going on where we live. And then you have to define those terms again. So here's some terms we talked about in chapter 8, abiotic and biotic. Actually brought these up quite a few times. So bio means life and a means without. So the interaction of the bios of the living organisms and the non-living organisms, and how the living use the non-living and then get recycled back into it for future use. The consumer levels. So I think everybody has seen this. This is just a food chain. It's showing you the arrow is taking the food to the consumer. So at the bottom, the photosynthesizer is being eaten by the primary consumer. So the arrow is taking the food to the consumer. And then the primary consumer is eaten by the secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. So where the arrow goes to is what's being consumed by what. The 10%, hopefully some of you recognize this. We've already talked about the first law of thermodynamics in chapter 4 and chapter 5. That is what goes in. The matter, the molecules that go into an equation, come out complete, like their quantity, but they come out changed. So in the second law of thermodynamics, we're talking about energy, that it starts in a concentrated form, kind of like a cell phone battery. And then even if you don't have that cell phone turned on, it's going to diffuse. It's going to become less concentrated. So as the energy, so this producer captured all its energy from what? From the sun. And then it used a lot of these calories to keep its metabolic processes going. So only 10% of all of the energy this photosynthesizer caught from the sun was actually fixed into tissue, remember chapter 9, and then consumed by this, the primary consumer. So that's what the 10% means. Of all the energy this consumed, only 10% of it was actually fixed as an edible, as a consumable product to give this consumer energy. So where did the 90% go? It went off as metabolism, body heat, mitosis, meiosis, cellular reproduction, cellular respiration. So keep doing that. All these chapters are still coming together at this point. So, and how about symbiosis? So again, I hope this is something you've seen before. Sym means together, bio means life, to live together. But there's different kinds of these relationships. There is a mutualistic relationship. So the little birds are eating the parasites, the ticks, the fleas off of I think it's an ibis. I'm not really sure. And so they're getting benefited because they're getting fed, and the ibis is getting benefited because it's getting cleared of pathogens and parasites. That is mutualism. It's mutual. This one is commensalism. It's the most difficult one for students to remember. So the bird nests in the tree. Well, the tree isn't harmed and the bird is helped because it gets it out of the way of predators to a safer place so more progeny, more offspring can survive. So it's the tree's not harmed and the bird is benefited. That's commensalism. And then the last one is something I bring up because it's Florida, Pythium insidiosum, and it is what the word says, insidiosum. It is they don't even really know what it is. They don't know if it's a fungus. It acts like a fungus and it acts like a protist. And it's an organism that burrows deeper and deeper and deeper into the flesh of an animal, dogs, cats, humans, horses. It gets in through the consistent exposure to wet grass. And with horses, it's around the fetlock, around the coronet band. And you might be familiar if you know horses of white line disease. Well, it's not like that, but that's one of the ways it gets in. If the horse is always in wet grass. And so if a human gets it, you can cut the leg off and you can save the person, but you can't really cut the leg off a horse. So typically they're destroyed. At this point, I do not know if there's any even treatment for that. What they do is they normally try to surgically remove it and save the limb. But you can only go so far, and that parasite will dig deeper and deeper into the flesh, liquefy it, drink it, kind of like a fungus. That's how a fungus feeds. But a fungus usually only feeds on dead things. This is feeding on living tissue, and that's really, really rare. Um, and that is a parasitic relationship, kind of like mistletoe. Most people can't even pick mistletoe out. All they think about is Christmas. Mistletoe is a big, bushy looking thing. It's about a foot or two in diameter, and it lives off of the other of the tree. So you'll see it growing in an oak tree or different kinds of typically deciduous trees, but there are all kinds, not necessarily pine. It doesn't like monocots. And it's very dark green and it looks different than the rest of the tree. And if you get enough of those mistletoe balls in a tree, it'll kill the tree because it's sending its root into the phloem and xylem, remember that? And using the food that the tree's making for itself. So mistletoe is a parasite too, just like this. So the host is either harmed or killed, and the infectious agent is benefited until it kills the host, which is kind of the dumb thing about parasites in a lot of cases. So try to run some other examples through and see. Here is an example, kind of got that GIF going on as you're looking at the example in the bottom left of the slide. And can you tell, is that mutualism, commensalism, or parasitism in the bottom left? It's kind of like the ibis, right? It's the, some of my students said that's a honey badger. I have no idea. But they're cleaning the parasites off the warthog because trust me, if that warthog didn't want those things on it, they wouldn't be there. So that has to be a mutualistic relationship. They're not eating him. So as you're watching the GIF go through, you can see in this course, we go from cell, tissue, organ system, and organism. This kind of includes a more macroscopic view. We will talk about a population a little bit in here and some different ecosystems, but for the most part, that's it. It's just the going back to some of the ecological terms, and the main focus of this chapter is going to be understanding how the elements, the matter that makes up organisms, living organisms, are recycled. So that's the main focus. But just understanding that there's still a biological hierarchical organization to all of this. And it really does help to recall that as we go through. So here is another example of a food chain and a food web. So you can see there is a chain on multiple places in this diagram. Chains go straight up. So the bottom level, you can have decomposers, then you have producers, which photosynthesize, then you have primary consumers and secondary consumers. That would be a food chain. As you start to draw the arrows horizontally and showing relationships horizontally and within a consumer level, like primary or secondary, then that's a food web. It's just a little bit more complex. And what that will help to show is pioneer species. So for instance, or key indicator species. In other words, if one species in an environment starts disappearing, like trout in a river, it starts to tell people that the quality of the water is declining. Because like canary in the mine, trout are very sensitive. So it's that kind of thing. It shows that you're looking at the web for different reasons. But no matter what, as you go from the base of the arrow to the point of the arrow, that's the way the food is flowing. And that means that only 10% is moving on. Here is a more complex food web. It's showing you, again, you're seeing the producers. Well, you start with the decomposers on the left. Without the decomposers, you have nothing. If you cannot take molecules and reduce them to elements, the plants can't eat. So, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And so the decomposers reduce the molecules down to elements. Then the producers can consume the elements, make the molecules they need using the sunlight to make the glucose and all these other rubisco, glucose, a whole bunch of molecules. We only scratch the surface. And then the primary consumers, the herbivores, typically, eat the producers, and then the secondary consumers and the tertiary consumers. And as you can see on this web, it gets kind of crazy up in there. So, second law of thermodynamics. This diagram is pretty straightforward. You can see all the energy starts at the sun. Hydrogen and hydrogen come together through fusion to make helium. So everything is about the hydrogen. We've been through this, right? We started in chapter 4. Everything's about the hydrogen. And we're not even talking about pH, which that's really important, because if pH is off, well, then you don't have enzymes. And if you don't have enzymes, you can't do metabolism. And if you don't have metabolism, you don't have life, right? So everything's about hydrogen, even the energy coming from the sun. So the plants, the producers, photosynthesize, capture the sunlight, and then they're consumed by a primary consumer, typically an herbivore. And then the secondary consumer consumes the herbivore, and then the tertiary consumer, and so on and so forth. So you can see a couple hours coming out of here. You can see the heat coming off the top. That is true for endotherms, like humans. We make our own body heat, and typically depends on your climate control and where you live. 80% of your calories go to maintain body heat, believe it or not. Again, that would change slightly from ecosystem to ecosystem or climate, but that's the standard number. And then the other percentages will go off as making new cells, waste production, through the digestive system and through the urinary system. And you have the metabolism chapters, right? Chapter 4, chapter 6, and chapter 7, because we're talking about animals. That's where the calories go. And so if you give off 80 as heat, 10% as, well, and heat is metabolism. Heat is chapter 4, cellular respiration. That's where your heat comes from, a mitochondria. Just want to make sure I review that. 10% for all other functionality, like urinary system, digestive system, cardiovascular system, cellular production, protein synthesis, and then 10% of the actual captured energy in the muscle tissue that another animal would eat that can actually go into the ecosystem as energy is passed on. So that's the second law. So just understanding that 90% goes off as metabolism. It isn't wasted, it isn't lost, it's just transferred to another state, usually more dilute. This is another diagram, data coming out of Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. They did one on this too, of Silver Springs. It's just interesting. You don't have to know it, but it's a very local example of them showing net primary productivity. They said in class one time, what? They didn't even know it was a dog. That's a Hungarian Poli dog. I had to look it up. These are just wacko cartoons about entropy. So the second law of thermodynamics is defined in one word as entropy, but that's not helpful if you don't understand the 90 and the 10 and what happens with that. So put those two together and you got more of an understanding of that second law. And here's the net primary productivity I was talking about. So think of your paycheck, right? Gross is the whole paycheck. Net is after the government gets done with taxation, right? Or whatever else you're doing. So this is a diagram showing you the life of a plant, as it says. And it's kind of mixing in there some agribusiness kind of stuff and where losses are. So all the sun goes into the plant. Well, then why do we only get this much harvest out of the crops? And things that can happen, where some of it goes. They do cellular respirate, and I think you've been through that now. They mitochondria use some of the glucose to keep alive during off seasons and during when the sun's not out. You don't have to go into detail on this diagram. It just gives you more of an understanding of the second law. I keep using animal examples. Well, this would be a plant example strictly, and more so into agribusiness and what farmers have to do to get a good yield to harvest so they can go to market. So yeah, and the sun powers it all. And bioaccumulation and biomagnification. I think those terms in and of themselves make sense. You accumulate in the life, you magnify within the life, and more specifically in the body tissues. And more specifically, which tissues? Okay, connective And the biggest example is adipose. That is where biomagnification of toxins take place. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures of this methylmercury or mercury. We're not going to get real technical, it's mercury. And how it arrives into the, well, 70% of the earth is water. So that's where a lot of this is going to go, from runoff, from evaporation, and then precipitation. It's going to wind up in the oceans. And then notice how at the bottom, the red dot is supposed to represent mercury as it gets bigger and bigger as the primary, the secondary, the tertiary consumers consume a mass amount of the under consumer level. And it just builds up, builds up. It doesn't flush out of the system itself. Here's another image of it showing you all the way up. It's kind of like a creative food chain. It gets in the water, then the algae, which are photosynthesizers, technically classified as protists, not necessarily a plant, even though they do photosynthesize. And then you get your primary consumer, secondary, and so forth. And then you have mercury concentrating in the fat tissues once you get up into the animals. And then if you catch that big fish, then you're kind of getting a pretty big dose of mercury. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but if you do deep sea fishing, selenium is one of the best treatments for binding up the mercury and getting rid of it faster than it just kind of leaving your body over time. Because it can really interfere with enzyme formation, especially in the nervous system. And here's this image helps you understand where some of the toxins are coming from. Mines, industrial pollution, energy production, even natural events will release mercury from the Earth's crust, as well as other toxins that, and even natural sources of elements that get in the water in high amounts. So it's not just mercury, but mercury is one of the ones that is kind of a man-made issue. But that's bioaccumulation. I just picked him because he looked like Smeagol. Thought it was funny. And then you have glyphosate. There's an argument about glyphosate. You don't know about that. It's an herbicide they spray on plants. Does it bioaccumulate? Some sources say yes, some credible sources say no. There's arguments about it causing cancer, which is why Bayer, that big pharmaceutical company, bought out Monsanto. Look that up if you want a good topic for a paper. And what that's going to happen, because Bayer is owned by Germany. And Monsanto was a United States company. There's a lot going on there. But just understanding that it's not just mercury. It's just a simple example to use as an example in the homework and on the exam. So, can you apply the first and second laws of thermodynamics in that picture? Most students point out, wait a minute, you got a cow, but she's eating a chicken wing or a chicken thigh. Yeah, they're pretty sharp. You guys catch stuff like that. So try to do that. Try to walk through what is the first law and apply it here. And what is the second law and apply it here? What should be written at the ends of some of those arrows? And I'll give you a hint. For the first law, you're going to need the equations to understand how to apply those with the arrows from the molecules on the reactant side to the molecules on the product side. And there's a concept map template that you should fill in at the end of the book and use it. It really helps. So these are the biogeochemical cycles: water, carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And so these are the diagrams in the book, and what I'm going to try to show you are simpler diagrams, like I promised, as we go through, because you do not need to know all these on this slide. So we're going to start with water. I think any student, if you just pause the video, wrote down what you think are the parts of the water cycle, you'd get it right. Most people would get it. There's probably one, percolation, that most people don't know, but I'm going to just think of a coffee pot percolator, right? The water goes at the top, it's real hot, it percolates down through the grounds and comes out into your basket and you drink the coffee. That's what our water does as it returns to the aquifer. So if you associate that, it might help you. So we're going to start with water, and these are the parts I want you to know, but I also have another diagram. Another thing you might resemble percolation to is a perk test. If you live out in rural areas and you have a septic system, the county does a perk test. In other words, how fast does the water move through the soil? And if it doesn't meet their standards, they make you do one of those horrible sand mounds, expensive, horrible sand mounds. If it does percolate well, then you don't need one and you can put a normal septic tank with a drain field in it. So that's just some other way you might associate. You might have heard it before. That's why they call it a perk test. This is a horrible diagram I did not create, showing you one part of the water cycle, which is transpiration. Transpiration is a fancy word for evaporation, except it goes through a plant because it transpires, right? It comes up through the root. What's the property of water for that? Adhesion, cohesion, remember? And it comes out the stomates, just kind of forms a vacuum. And most of the water, though, is used in the leaves for photosynthesis. Remember, it's split, and then the hydrogen is carried over to turn into glucose, and the oxygen is given off as gas for other organisms. So, but transpiration is a part of the cycle, and here's a simpler diagram. So I don't understand. You have a giraffe, you have a rhinoceros, and then you have that. I don't know. I just thought it was funny, so I left it in there. So you have evaporation coming off of bodies of water. Transpiration also helps with that. That's just evaporation through a tree. Think T for tree. And then that forms clouds and condenses and then precipitates, hits the earth. We don't do runoff. We do percolation. So that's the term missing is percolation. So don't forget that. We don't do runoff, and I don't talk about respiration. I bring that up in the carbon cycle. So those are the water cycle terms that you need to learn. Pretty straightforward for water. So the carbon cycle. So you have already learned this. I know you're thinking, no, I haven't. Yeah, you have. So I've already pushed you to apply the first law of thermodynamics. What goes in comes out changed. Well, since we're a carbon-based organism, we use which molecule for cellular respiration? Glucose, which starts with C, which is carbon. And then how does the carbon come out? CO2. Well, that's part of the cycle. And what's the reverse of cellular respiration? Photosynthesis. So you already know the two main processes of the carbon cycle, cellular respiration and photosynthesis. There is another one I'm going to ask you to know because as we have 8 billion people on this planet, probably 9 billion by now, who knows, the census isn't accurate. We do a lot of fossil fuel burning. So that is exacerbating the carbon being released at a faster rate than it naturally would. And that's why you hear this carbon sequestration that they talk about a lot, which is why they want to, we're trying to push for regenerative farming, not no tilling. Because as you till, you're losing a lot of that carbon into the atmosphere by till farming. So when you turn the soil up is what I'm getting at. If you just regenerative farm, you use cows to come in, then use cover crops, and then you plant. So you have to give the land a rest and let it regenerate and get microbes and mycorrhizae, and then you have more nutrient crops. And you think, well, how do they seed the land? Well, they use these machines that just kind of have like little needles, and they roll and they distribute seeds that way. They inject it down into the soil, not exposing the topsoil to evaporation and degradation. So there is a lot of, I don't ask you to know that one, but I do ask you to know fossil fuels. So here is the simpler diagram. Like I said, in every one, there's going to be another diagram. So you have the carbon dioxide plants, use carbon dioxide to make glucose. And you can see the photosynthesis here, and you see the cellular respiration there. And it's just going to go back and forth. So making sure you still understand those equations and that they reverse themselves as they keep life going on this planet. And then the last one, like I said, is fossil fuel burning is another way that it gets recycled. Carbon gets recycled. This is a more complex diagram. I mean, there are other ways that carbon returns to the atmosphere and then goes and is swapped within solid molecular form, but I'm not going into it. You know the basics. The takeaway is that you know it has to be recycled for life to continue on the planet. That's my takeaway, and that you know a little bit about it. But it is interesting looking at decomposition, because that decomposition aids to a lot of this. Without, like we said before, Without the bacteria and without the fungus, we wouldn't have life on this planet. Because both bacteria can photosynthesize and decompose. Honestly, that's all the Earth needs is bacteria. Photosynthesizing and heterotrophic bacteria, and the Earth would be fine. But it's kind of sad, but it's true. Okay, the nitrogen cycle. You kind of have to stop and pause for a second. You got to bring back your earth science experience. Think about the atmosphere. This is a good place to start. So you think about all the gases that make up the atmosphere. So what are they? Well, you know we need oxygen. And maybe you learned in this course already 20 to 21% oxygen. So what's the biggest component of our atmosphere? Nitrogen. Not N, nitrogen, N2. Everything's a gas. It has to be met with the octet rule, remember? So N doesn't exist on its own, it's N2. O doesn't exist on its own, it's O2. And then there's CO2. Those are the three predominant gases. I would say nitrogen and oxygen, but CO2 is 0.035%. Nitrogen is 78%. So the trick is we need to get nitrogen fixed into a solid so that we can make it for which macromolecule. That's going back to chapter 2. What macromolecule, I'll give you a hint, what macromolecule do vegetarians have to be very careful to get a lot of? Protein, because protein is the only macromolecule with nitrogen. And it's hard for plants to get that, take that up in the right amino acid base. You need the essential and the non-essential amino acids, and you need them balanced, or they won't go over the cell membrane. They won't go over the phospholipid bilayer. So vegans and vegetarians have to be careful. So we did that one, protein. And how does it do this? Well, back to the previous slide when I was talking, what does the earth need? The only thing the earth needs as far as an organism is bacteria. So there's your answer. Nitrogen fixing bacteria. You do not even have to know the names of them. Here's the complex diagram that you see in the book. There is a lot here. I'm going to ask you to prove to me that you realize the most amount of nitrogen is in the atmosphere. And the trick is getting it from a gas to a solid, and then a solid back to a gas. And that can only be done by bacteria. And you might think, well, if I eat legumes, legumes have nitrogen in them like beans. Beans are a legume. Clover is a legume, alfalfa. Right, but the plant doesn't do it on its own. It's living in, wait for it, symbiosis, mutualistic symbiosis with the bacteria in the root nodules. So that's why when you do a cover crop in farming, like you say you harvested your corn, you want to do a cover crop that's a nitrogen fixer, because it has that bacteria that's going to grab the nitrogen from the air, push it into the soil, regenerate the soil, and then you have the cows on it that'll have manure, and their cloven hooves will dig up the soil a bit to help, keep the microbes happy. And then you put a crop on the following year. So this nitrogen cycle is very, very important, because without proteins, you don't have life. Your tissues, your muscle, your skin, your enzymes, your antibodies, your immune system, your hair, your nails, your cartilage, your tendons, your ligaments, it's all protein. So you would not exist without this nitrogen cycle. So you can just go thank a bacteria today. So again, there's a simpler diagram for this, and that's what I'm asking you to know, the term of it becoming solid and then becoming gas. Cultural eutrophication is important to know what it means is cultural. In other words, humans do it. Eutrophication means high or good growth, and it's actually a bad thing. So as we like our lawns to be a certain color of green, or the homeowners association gets on your butt, I don't have one of those, but some people do, the excess fertilizer is washed off of the lawn into the gutters and goes into the waterways. What that does then is causes massive growth of plant life in the water. And you might think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, that plant life has to die. And when that plant life dies, it has to decompose. And when the bacteria decompose it, it uses oxygen. And when you use up the oxygen, you use all the oxygen, enough of it to kill aquatic organisms. So cultural eutrophication leads to a low biological oxygen. It raises the biological oxygen demand and lowers the oxygen levels so that the animals that need the oxygen in the water, it's not there and they die. So cultural eutrophication is bad, and it's typically from factory farm runoff and fertilizer spray runoff from major housing communities that use a lot of it. NPK, you might see the three numbers on a fertilizer bag. 888, 10, 5, 10, who knows? But that's what those numbers stand for. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's a Latin thing, that's why K, but you might know that from your minerals that you need to stay healthy. You need potassium, and it's K. It's just from the periodic table of elements. So nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus and potassium are those three numbers in that order on a fertilizer bag. And you need, hopefully you got it, bacteria. And here's the simpler diagram. So I'm asking you to know, as the solid, these are just two examples. You don't need to know them. There's many other examples. Most of your proteins have nitrogen in them. So there's a ton of nitrogen molecules that are solid, but these are just two examples. So when the solid nitrogen molecules are denitrified into a gas, that's done by bacteria. And when the gas is nitrified, in other words, nitrogen fixation, into a solid form of nitrogen, that is done by bacteria, and that's called nitrogen fixation. They're the two terms you have to know: denitrification and nitrogen fixation, and knowing that it's necessary for proteins, and knowing that bacteria do it. You don't have to know their names, you just have to know that they're bacteria. And you have the phosphorus cycle. So hopefully your brain's going a little bit and you're thinking, phosphorus, phosphorus. Why do I know that word? Hopefully you know that word, because it's something you need every second, every second. You make your body weight in it every day in cellular respiration, chapter 4. So what does cellular respiration make? ATP. Phosphorus, adenosine triphosphate. So phosphorus, you could talk all day about phosphorus. I mean, some of the history behind it, how they used to make gunpowder by dehydrating urine. So they'd have all the soldiers in the Civil War, they'd urinate in these barrels and they dehydrate it and they'd collect the solids, and the solids, nitrogen, phosphorus, right? Because they're coming out of us. That's part of the cycles, the biogeochemical cycles. And yes, you can glow in the dark. That's how they first found that. But they're also very reactive. If you look on the periodic table where they're at, they're very reactive, cations, and they can, if put in the right way, combined in the right way, they become explosive. That's why they limit fertilizer purchases. And here's another simple diagram to explain it. Phosphorus can come from rock, it can come from decomposition, and it can come from, which is the same thing, but animal waste, even our waste. That's what's so silly. What we do with our waste is we should be decomposing it, but people get the weebie-jeebies over that, and they don't like that. But make sure you understand now, the energy molecule that we make every second, that would be ATP. A macromolecule that makes up our tissue, like I said, just like nitrogen for proteins, you need phosphorus for proteins. That's why the inside, it's one of the other reasons the inside of a nerve cell is so negative, because phosphates are negative and proteins are negatively charged typically. If you remember that from chapter 9. And then you got the NPK, you get the P of the NPK now. This is the middle number. So plants need these elements in a very certain range and number based on their species. So maybe looking at this diagram back from chapter 5, you can see some of the cycles. So you can see how this is tying everything in. So at the very top, you see the what cycle, the water cycle, the NADP to the NADPH. You see the P cycle, right? Or more specifically, the ADP to the ATP. But phosphorus is cycled in the NADP. It's needed for it and cycled through it. And then you have carbon being cycled. CO2 comes in, what does it come out as? Glucose. So all of these biological or metabolic processes performed by enzymes play a role in these biogeochemical cycles. And sulfur. So we don't talk a lot about sulfur. You sure know that someone had sulfur if they had eggs and they hang out with you that day. I grew up with brothers, sorry. So the sulfur cycle is in a lot of things. It's in rock, it's in natural moving of the earth and emissions of the earth. It's in our waste, so burning fossil fuels. Coal has a lot of sulfur in it, so if they put filters on them, they call them scrubbers, but they don't always get all of it. So you got some in the clouds that comes down in precipitation. You got some coming out of volcanoes. You got some emitting naturally from wear and tear and erosion on rock and soil. But what I want you to get is that you need sulfur to shape protein. So you know the proteins. So when the protein is going through protein synthesis and the ribosomes are putting together the amino acids to make a polypeptide, the next step is that polypeptide has to go into the rough endoplasmic reticulum that you only have to know as RER, and that's going to shape that protein. Well, this is the very important element that's used. So once the protein is shaped, it has to be held into that shape, kind of like a little glue. That's what sulfur does. Sulfur keeps proteins in their correct shape as they go around and do their jobs. Because remember, an enzyme is a protein, and it's doing a lot of work, and it gets recycled over and over before it finally gets recycled. So what I mean is an enzyme can be used thousands of times before it gets to where it is not functioning right, and it has to be broken down and then reformed. And the reason it can do that is because these sulfur bridges, these sulfur bonds are really strong in holding those proteins into the right shape.